Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Anna. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's great to have everybody here again. And just a little bit about the panel today. It's really going to focus on Gen AI and applications in finance. And we want to do it a little more interactive with the audience as well. So I'll kick it off with a few questions. And then if the audience has any question or follow-up, you just raise your hand and then we can kind of keep the discussion sort of going, right? So it's not like an interrogation of the panelists. So, it should be more kind of open. So, yeah, I mean, obviously everyone here knows, right, a lot of applications of Gen AI in finance have kind of gone into more mature, shall we say, levels, right, whether they're internal or external. I think one theme, like in market intelligence, we kind of focus a lot on risk management software, and of course some structural models and machine learning. But one theme that we may not have touched as much is sort of using AI for investing. So, I'll hand it to the panelists if you have any opinions about how would you use AI for investing. Have you seen it before? What are the drawbacks? What type of benchmarks to gauge efficacy against it? So please feel free.
Shall I go first? Hi, everybody. AI or generative AI?
Generative AI.
Okay,
Yeah.
because AI is nice, we know it. When it comes to generative AI and investments, as you probably know, it's a tricky subject. Definitely when I'm thinking of risk management and beyond LLMs, because generative AI is not just LLMs, right? You can think of using them to create, any kind of stochastic process. When it comes to investing, it's a little bit more challenging, and the challenges, as you know, are around regulation, around what data has been used. When it comes to benchmarking, of course, I don't think you can have specific benchmarks. At the end of the day, you either make money or not. So the benchmarks are going to be around, excess return, risk-adjusted return, hopefully low volatility of the investment return, etc. But going back to generative AI, in addition to all the difficulties that models come with, also the difficulties we often have to make the PMs comfortable with using them, the additional challenge is the fact that they are extremely complex. So there is definitely, if before having like a random forest was difficult to explain, that is impossible to explain. So all in being a black box, blacker than all, and the blackest, not knowing what kind of exposures you assume from the regulatory perspective. I think these are distinct challenges that probably are the reasons why we haven't been very active on the investment front with generative AI.
Yeah, I think I want to start maybe just a quick self-introduction so you can see why I mentioned those use cases, the business applications of the AI, where I'm from. So I am Hongfei. I'm leading a data analytics team at Osso Capital. So we are a private equity firm specializing in the real estate investment. So our use cases coming from the real estate investment or the property management from those applications. And prior to that, I also worked at Point72, a hedge fund. So I will use the alternative data and run the proprietary research and to support a long-short the trading investment. So that's my background. So that's why you may hear some use cases that's kind of associated with my experience. So in terms of the AI applications in the business, just based on my limited knowledge or limited experience, we have the two different major areas. For the investment, directly support of the investment, we primarily focus on the predictive modeling. For example, when I worked in the hedge fund, we focus on can we predict the business performance? Can we leverage the alternative data to predict the top line revenue, for example? So the predictive modeling, the advanced machine learning techniques, that's the major tool we use, we leverage. And now when I move to the real estate investment, we also focus on the predictive modeling for the market selection, especially for the real estate industry. And meanwhile, we also, because we are small firm, we have limited resources. We have a lot of the manual process on the documentation. No matter for the leasing agreements or for the loan agreements, there are a lot of legal documents we need to process. So by using the generative AI can help us a lot to make sure that we can extract the agreement terms to make sure the consistency of the agreements. So that's how we currently use the AI technology in our business.
I'm Aaron Mendell, the Federal Reserve, and we're using it primarily for regulatory use cases, but I have worked for hedge funds in the past, and I have worked at Stanley for 10 years. And I can give you some answers, because obviously with that background, I've been thinking about how it can be used for trading as well and investment opportunities. But before I say anything else, I have required to say these are my thoughts, not Federal Reserve's. So one of the things which I think is a big opportunity is to use language models to explore the complex relationships between the assets that you're trading. So in the equities, it would be everything from the calls that they make to analyst reports to documents that they file with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And by going through this vast corpus of information, you can make a lot of connections and inferences. You can extract information. You can try to figure out what the influences are. I mean, you can measure the influences statistically, but you can also measure them in terms of actually who they're doing business with and what they rely on. So you can get an added dimension of information. And just exploring that whole range from filings to their comments to what different analysts say that follow the firms. It's too much for any one person or expert to keep in their head, but language models can follow all this, and they can also keep track of the accuracy of their forecasts and predictions and comments on the markets. So you could get a report which both contrasts and summarize what the different analysts are saying. Saying this fellow thinks Apple's going up because such and such, but he was contradicted, but this other analyst said this. And you can put it into a concise form, so throughout the day, traders can be updated on what people are saying, which clearly influences the market, as well as all the news information and alerts, which are constantly coming up. So prior to large language models and generative AI, I think it would be impossible for anyone to be completely informed about all these different sources of information. So it allows for a much more timely analysis of what's going on, and timing is very important. So that's one area. Another area is in generating data. So just like language models can be used to generate language, language models can also generate financial information. So one of the things we're actually doing at the Fed, this isn't for trading because we don't trade other than some of the treasury markets, but we're concerned with simply moving data from system to system, say. So we're going through a cloud transformation, and there are security issues because we have a lot of confidential information. So we have requirements for generating synthetic data, which looks like the data which we would be putting into these systems. And it's shockingly easy to use something like ChatGPT to generate data. We were just evaluating money laundering, anti-money laundering systems. And it already knew what the different message types were on Swift without even telling it. And then we could just say, this is how the system works, give a little paragraph, generate transactions, and sure enough, it would generate a lot of transactions. Then we could create a prompt saying, okay, here's a few ways people launder money, and explain a few of the typographies. And it was really good at money laundering. So you could test systems, and it would normally have taken a programmer, a real-time working probably a week, but in calendar time maybe a month to deliver something that could do this, and we got it in an hour. So it could be a huge productivity enhancer, and it just goes on and on. I think in terms of also something which I think hasn't been done quite yet, but I think is really promising, is people are talking about more sophisticated ways of embedding the state of the market and macroeconomic factors. And if you come up with a good way of tokenizing that, which captures things, then you could train a large language model to capture a much higher dimensional view of all the trading assets, which may prove out to be a very valuable tool. But this is research at this point.
Can I continue? Okay, I thought we agreed we're discussing investments, not risk management, right? Which is fine, but because I agree with you, all these are really good cases, use cases. However, I'm a big believer in content consumption because, as you said, who has time to read all those things and retain information and do comparisons? However, how do you guarantee that there is no omission of material information? So I guess what I'm trying to bring it to is that it depends on your budget, your risk budget, if you're going to use it for investing, right? Because again, summarization guarantees a shorter piece of text, not necessarily the right piece of text.
So basically to summarize, interrogate documents, summarize, but it doesn't necessarily help with the investment decision, or it could, but there's no proof one way or another.
And in order to validate, it's catch-22. In order to say, okay, is that correct, you'll have to go through the document anyway. Don't get me wrong, I'm just being like a little bit devil's advocate. I see the value. We are using it for exactly all the use cases that you mentioned, but there are risks.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. No, fair enough, yeah.
Same thing with people. You can't make sure what they're telling you is true either.
Exactly.
It's not like we didn't make mistakes in the investment process before.
Yeah. I mean, again, to kind of tie it back a bit, like you hit on like a key topic, like compliance and this and regulation around AI. Like, where do you see? I mean, it's like we talked, was mentioning earlier, right? Like, splitting random forest was still difficult. How do you regulate basically generative AI, right? Especially if someone does use this in a way to create some hedge fund that isn't necessarily directly under the Federal Reserve or SEC purview necessarily. Is there some regulation coming in somehow? Is there some way to how do you actually create those rules to kind of manage Gen AI specifically in institutional finance? Do you know of any bodies or any committees or something around that area?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we have the White House put a document out recently.
Yeah.
So that's one organization which has an opinion on it. We have a lot of governance discussions about it. And I think it's probably the dominant conversation if you were to do a pie chart of what people talk about at the Federal Reserve in terms of AI. The major slice taking up probably 90% of the pie is governance. Because you have reputational risk. You have, we can't afford, the Federal Reserve cannot afford to do what Google did and have a press conference and show it working and doing the wrong thing. Because then, so we're very conservative about putting it into action. I would say that it will be a while until we have autonomous AI doing policy at the Federal Reserve, if ever.
That's great to hear. From our standpoint, we have created a generative AI committee trying to start establishing some, guidelines and start writing some policies, et cetera, But as you kind of alluded, I think the challenge is that this is a constantly changing landscape. And from the regulatory standpoint, that is as well. I often wonder whether the way we build things, whether, I don't know what kind of regulation will come up and we will have to rebuild all over again, right? Because it is a change and it's a moving target for now. So even like keeping up though with what you're supposed to comply with is probably going to be challenging. But yeah, these internal committees, under these various work streams, one for governance, the other for bringing technology, innovation back in a safe way, and who knows what else, other structures.
Yeah, we do the same thing, right? On the market intelligence side, we have committees and basically using large language models. We use them very carefully depending on where the areas, like when Andre was talking about the pricing areas, we probably wouldn't go necessarily that deep to the pricing because that has to have a lot of transparency around how we kind of calculated a composite spread, right? Well, we do kind of, we are using it to kind of really replace some of the a lot of the writing that we tend to summarize documents for an audience who may have to go through 20 plus pages, and then we can kind of quickly jump into it. Also interactivity. So it's nice to be able to interrogate the document and have feedback around it, especially when you look at, for example, ratings research documents, which tend to be quite broad and long. Yeah, like on the rating side, for example, like, you know, I'm not aware that they're using any of it, right? Because it has a high regulatory threshold, has to follow a lot of criteria. You can kind of use it more as a challenger, but not what you would actually base a decision on. And MI, since we're building this, basically risk management software, we're able to kind of use it more freely in a way.
I also think there needs to be governance about privacy. And also, let me start with privacy. I think AI and generative AI can give people that have enough resources an unfair advantage, unfair to the point that it could even be considered, I mean, not legally now because there's no laws written, but insider trading. Let me give you a scenario. Suppose you use geolocation data from C-level people in companies that you're trading and find that they're going to be treated for cancer. So this hasn't been announced yet. You can tell they've gone to MSK, they've gone here, they've gone there. Should you be able to use that information in trading, or is it a violation of HIPAA in some way? Not technically speaking, but certainly it goes beyond the intent. Or if you use psychometric analysis a little bit too far, and you think that someone's becoming unstable who's in charge of a company, and you start trading off of this, or perhaps you can just let your imagination go in terms of the way surveillance could become alternative data, and the way that we're no longer looking at oil tankers and seeing how far this emerged in the water, but we're actually tracking, because of its capacity, employees of a company, their social media posts, their entries on LinkedIn. I mean, you could detect whether things are optimistic, pessimistic. You could look at pharmaceutical companies and probably figure out whether their drug was approved before it was announced based on the restaurants they're checking into and social media. So where do you draw the line?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, right? Especially in these areas where privacy is quite important. And we deal with a lot of proprietary information as well, and it's kind of, you know, it's like using something kind of open source and freely available. You don't want to use that on your proprietary information, right? Yeah, no, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, it is a very kind of evolving field, shall we say, right? Is there any, like, I mean, on a more, I guess, kind of negative way, like, what do you see Gen AI's drawbacks, really? Like, there, you know, obviously hallucinations is one, right? Like, are there any other ones you see them applied for numerical calculations or anything in that space?
Numerical calculations were infamously bad in the beginning. They've made great improvements through this chain of thought process that was mentioned in one of the earlier talks. So it turns out that if you explain, even in a prompt, how to do the calculation, it does a better job. And with fine-tuning, you can do better still. And then with using it, having it know when to go to an API and just use a calculator, it does really well. So it is getting much better in that sense. But it comes to another point, which is, I think, a real drawback, is if people believe that what comes out of it is a gold standard of truth. That is the real danger. We've always had this with computers, because somehow, whether we're talking about going back in the day, you go back 50 years to the punch card systems, people said, oh, this came from the computer, and put it up on a pedestal. And now with the AI, it really can sound convincing. So it's now got this, it can sound like an expert. And I think people tend to judge the quality of an answer with the smoothness of the delivery and the way it sounds like it's coming from an expert. And it can fool us from that, intentionally or unintentionally.
One thing in our business is the lack of the market dynamics, especially just one simple example is the pandemic. So when we build the models, typically we assume the history repeats, but with the market dynamics, it probably cannot be applied. Then how can we build the models to incorporate the latest information and then train our model to generate the updated information. I think that's the challenge.
I will echo that the risk is that of over-reliance. So I totally agree, Harry, that that is probably the most important thing. That said, again, like LLMs are notoriously bad, blah, 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 but there's so much more in generative AI than LLMs, right? So that's one clarification. The other thing is that there's also the risk of having a tool and looking for a nail, like a hammer and looking for a nail. I'm not sure that people make decisions and choices in a kind of performance risk cost context. And I can feel the pressure, frankly, right? Because people in the places we work, they want to see it. So there you are, not even having to convince yourself that that's the best solution, because classical NLP may do just fine, if not worse, if not better. So you're like, okay, so that is another risk, I think, of going like really applying it no matter where, right? Because we have to, it's the coolest, it is assumed it's the best. But again, we are in businesses, performance is not all of the story. Cost, risk is also, so that, yeah.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, you said, especially like this space, right, tends to be easier for the business users or to actually see the immediate responses, which creates a little bit of hype around it to kind of use it despite the problem maybe doesn't really need it, you know. But yeah, it's tricky, right? Like where that, especially with all the news around like Google's and you know all the innovation on the tech side, right? It's which is fine because you can open it up to a lot of consumers. They don't necessarily, it's a freemium model, right? You can, but on the financial side, where like in fintech, right? Like, you have to be careful with this, right? Especially when you can't.
Yeah, I would say you have to really have a strategy for dealing with it. Like no one is going to use ChatGPT-4 to check transaction by transaction on credit cards because it would cost more sometimes than the item being purchased. So you have to be economical. But what it does give you is the ability of creating a prototype in record time. So what I would suggest as a strategy in general is to use your generative model as a sandbox to create an application, to see that something's possible, to test a concept. And then once you have it to work and you want to put it into mass production, then get your data engineering and science team to reduce it from a trillion parameter model to maybe a 1 billion parameter model or smaller, because you can certainly do the specific things with much more parsimonious economical solutions, but it'll take a team, a while to get that to work. It might take a good data scientist a few days, but that's not the end of it, because getting it into production can take a ridiculous amount of time depending on the organization. Where if you have something like a ChatGPT-4 in-house, or an agreement, with Microsoft, so you can use on Azure to develop securely, people can throw these things together, very quickly, and then test them and see if they're useful, and then you can go down the pipeline. Now, of course, the costs will get less and less expensive, as I think was pointed out earlier. And for all we know, a decade from now, something with the ability to ChatGPT will be put in a throwaway, birthday card that you buy at Hallmark for $1 or $10 back then, or maybe $100, but anyway, with inflation.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean the way it's moving, yeah, it's quite possible. I mean, on a kind of a more, I guess, a broader topic, right? Like, everyone here has been obviously had exposure to generative AI and finance, and over the years, like we have now production systems that use it for their internal purposes or so. Like, but where do you see call it for the next 5 to 10 years? Where do you see AI and Gen AI potentially impacting finance the most, like in the financial industry? Which areas? Is it going to be like risk management? Is it trading? Is it back office, middle office? Is it, there must be some reason behind this technology that is disruptive and that tends to kind of impact certain types of roles and segments. So.
No. I think that people are doing more and more research themselves, consumers, on everything. So now, there's this joke about someone goes to the doctor and they say, well, Google told me, now it's ChatGPT told me this. And I'm sure they're driving their investment advisors crazy the same way now. And I think that people will want to be able to do their own research and interact, with these models in a lot of cases with their own investments. And I think that the banks and the investment firms will want to cater to that. And I think they'll be making a lot of expertise available in a conversational way. It's a good interface and people can drill down. And I think people will be demanding, as consumers, more and more of this. We just had a very interesting talk from Citi, where they have a very enlightened view of this. And I imagine that with that enlightened view, they'll be developing products which make them very competitive with other major banks which don't have these services. So I think it'll be something to attract business, something to accelerate business, and it will grow through use. Yeah.
I can see there's several aspects. One is that the AI, the technology certainly help us a lot to improve the efficiency. No matter if for the predictive modeling, so it can give us a lot of power to improve the accuracy and also just improve the efficiency. So I can see my team, they just use the AI to generate the starter code, to debug code, just make our process so efficient. And also even for our investment, it can also help us a lot in our all kinds of the processes to reduce the manual time, to integrate the data from different sources, to run through all kinds of the processes, no matter the documentation, to track the documents, no matter what kind of processes those it involves. Just help us to build the automation power in our processes to streamline our production work. So that's the power we see, and I do see that it's growing a lot.
I think you kind of touched on software development, and Eric, we were discussing earlier, it seems that indeed it's going to be dominated, the one thing. The second thing, I like to think of content management in terms of my 3 C's: creation, consumption, characterization. I'm not going to bore you with characterization. If you're interested, come later, but there is lots of consumption of content. As I said earlier, it will depend on what risk budget you have. It's not the same on sales as it is on investments, getting something wrong, for example. But I do think indeed that it's going to be a lot around content management when it comes to LLMs. When it comes to generative AI, other than LLMs, I see potential that I currently think is not being discussed as much, even though it should. In particular, again, wherever stochastic processes are involved, anything from pricing an asset to risk management. You probably are all familiar with, the curse of dimensionality. So if you want to go to a multi-dimensional space and go variates, good luck with convergence. So there seem to be some studies indicating that you may be having a better solution with generative AI, again, non-language related. So I think these are going to be places where they have an advantage in dominating.
Okay, got it. No, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, do you see any specific, under the Gen AI sort of called bucket, right? Do you see any specific areas that are underutilized? We've seen RAGs being used more often now. Are there other sort of sides of this? I mean, obviously prompt engineering, we've been using it now to kind of make it respond a little more directly. Are there any other sort of areas you see that maybe we haven't sort of considered or haven't used as much in the industry yet? Non-language related, I suppose.
Right, that's definitely the one. But going back to RAG, etc., are we discussing like how can we make it better, or are we talking about like what parts of businesses we think it's not particularly?
Like more how to make it better, I would say.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
one thing that I don't hear people talk a lot, and probably for good reason, is few shot learning. My experience has been that the darn thing does not learn well with only few shots, but again, I'm a novice when it comes to few shot. However, it would be extremely beneficial. Can you imagine instead of having your old fashioned, dare I say, and it would be to classify sentiment or to quantify chattiness in a piece of text and finding all the irrelevant, right, or all the discussion happening in a context that is of no interest or relevance to labor. Let's say they're interested in labor economics, but within a specific context. So it'd be amazing if you gave it like 4 or 5 examples. This is a correct context. This is not a correct one, and have it learn. But it seems that so far, all academic research is around very like high levels of curation around the experiments. So that is one that remains to be seen. But it would be again extremely valuable. And then going back to synthetic data, etc., as you probably know, having lots of labeled data is usually a big problem. You will have people to sit down and annotate whether, going back to the same example, is this document or sentence talking about labor the way you're interested in? So if you need 10,000 samples of that, somehow you have to motivate humans to do it. However, through the simulation aspects, through the generative aspect, both LLMs or non-language generative AI will be able to help us create synthetic labeled data. So that is another thing that I think is important.
Yeah, we built, we used like our studio Shiny apps to motivate the folks to label.
Same here, yeah, we do that.
That was,
Trying to gamify.
yeah, it's like, oh, this is fun. But yeah, no, that's actually a very good point, right? Like it's to generate that, to train a new model.
So another thing, so when you mention RAG, there's something very related to RAG, which is what they call vector database. So it's like part of it. But that part itself should be examined a little more. For those that don't know, there are ways of embedding objects. It could be words, it could be data, it could be more or less anything into a vector space. And once you've done that, you can easily search for things that are similar to it or characteristic of it. So this could revolutionize the database, essentially, and the way we look for things. It's sort of like if you think about it in words, you no longer have to do a keyword search. You can search for meaning. Similarly, you don't have to match an exact object. You can say, show me an object that looks like this if it's visual. And for trading data, you could do the same thing. You could show a time series and say, show me where this time series pattern has appeared in different ways. Now, let me combine this with another very old idea, which was the data warehouse, which became the data lake, which is now the data mesh. But it's basically the idea that you throw all your corporate information into this system and it gets automatically cataloged and has governance and everything's great and anyone can find anything they want and use it at the click of a button. Well, so far there's still problems getting this fantasy to become a reality. A lot of it has to do with when it's cataloged, it's cataloging metadata, but as you know, programmers or database administrators aren't known for taking the time to really adequately document what each column means and what the context is, and so on and so forth. So one of the things we're actually looking at the Fed is a way of using large language models to see if it can untangle this mess. So we can actually have a way of searching for data which makes sense rather than what you still have, which is weird column names and data table names. So that's an application, but let's take it even a step further. Imagine if the latest generation of databases which are coming out, like Databricks is one, Snowflake is another, which I'm sure you're familiar with, even MongoDB, are all talking about adding vector capabilities to their databases, which means that along with your regular way of storing and retrieving the data, you also have the potential of searching for it with a vector. So if you were to have a system where everyone did that, and then let's say you've got all your documents, you can search for them this way, you want to implement RAG, you can implement an RAG on everything. Because now all your documents have been chunked already, they've been assigned to embeddings already, and you can basically do Q&A on your whole database. And that might fulfill the fantasy of the data warehouse.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we haven't actually used it as kind of something interesting to look at. Because we have a lot of columns, like a lot. They all make sense.
How many columns do you have?
ChromaDB is open source. If you want to try it out, even though it's not great.
Which was it?
ChromaDB.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. That's awesome. And well, I'll definitely take that. Okay, so I mean, we kind of see kind of the field sort of changing, right? Like, I mean, one thing that I think Hongfei basically mentioned a bit about it, but is like, Copilot and the use of actually Gen AI to generate code, right? I mean, how effective, I mean, in the trading business, I'm formerly 0.72, how do you really trust it? And is it really a situation where it's generating, say, factories and some form of design patterns that are kind of like folks can follow, or is it generating the code that's actually you would co-locate and trade against? Trade with.
Remember, AI is still a machine. It has to be operated and monitored or reviewed by human beings. So we are exploring the opportunities to how to integrate AI into our coding the practice. But still, currently, we are still using it mostly for the starter code and the debug code. And especially with our data scientist expert, just to make sure that they are generating the right result and with the right logic. So it should be a very rigorous process.
I will share what I like. Somebody had mentioned it to me that we are going from authors to editors. So it's exactly what you said, right? To create the first draft, and as you were saying earlier, Harry, that enables, fast iteration, rapid hypothesis testing. That then you can take it and you can develop a whole project out of it. It turns out to be interesting.
Also, just for small components, there's something I did earlier this week. So I was talking about looking at this anti-money laundering data and looking at messages. So, Python is probably my go-to language for these kind of things. So I load everything into a data frame, and then I start doing filters. And I don't know how many people here have done filters and group bys and these things. With Pandas, if you haven't done it the last week, you might have to look in the Google to see what the syntax is for it. And then I wanted to make it even easier. I wanted to put the rules for certain transactions, being over certain amounts, round numbers, beneficiaries, all these things. And I'd like to put those rules into another data frame. Why not? So it's really easy and have it so I can very quickly do things. So I started writing this, and so you know what? I'm just going to see what ChatGPT can do. So I said I want to do this, and I described that I want to have one data frame controlling the filters for the other data frame, and it spit out like 20 lines of code that worked beautifully. So
No with the plugin, not with copy purpose, just vanilla ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Wow. Awesome.
That's amazing.
In fact, it was 3.5.
And then, what I've seen as well is if you look at Stack Overflow's usage, I think it's dropped a lot.
Yeah.
Recently, since ChatGPT's been around. Sorry, yes.
A question on that, because I've experimented with coding and with that as well. And sometimes it works, but it doesn't code the way a human would in maybe logical ways. So it's a bit of a mystery sometimes in the way it puts together its process. So, I mean, like you were saying, moving from author to editor, could you follow what it was doing?
Oh, yeah, no, it was very clear. Well, it was a relatively simple task, so it was less than 20 lines of Python that it produced. And it was pretty elegant, actually. it's improved a lot. I remember when ChatGPT first came out, and I said, just write me a Python function for cosine similarity. And it was fine till it got to doing the dot product. I just spelled out dot product in the code. And so, but it's gotten better.
Yeah, any more questions from oh yes, please.
It's just to the mic so live streaming.
Yeah, so I had a quick question about the workforce changing and how you see that's going to be impacting hedge funds, private equity, or the Fed, especially with kind of this new understanding of whether it's going to be support vector machines, LLMs, etc., random forests, whether that's going to be, for example, a role that PMs are going to need to take on, how you see NPE, if that's going to be more thesis generation oriented or something else, or in the Fed more kind of like macro model analysis and then implement impacting policies and so forth, whether those organizations are going to shrink, grow, how it's going to fluctuate.
The $1 million question, Harry, I can see that you're ready.
No, go.
Go for
You
it.
can have it.
So, in a recent other panel, I remember making the argument that it's going to be mostly knowledge workers that, their lives will change. And somebody was like, no, I mean, it's not going to only be knowledge workers, there are other people, right, that are doing like catering or, doing, bringing food, etc. I was like, no, we're talking about generative AI. This has happened already. Like the fact that things are digital, the fact that you don't need to pick the phone and call somebody to order a pizza, but instead you go online, all this has happened already. So in that context, if you accept this as a premise, I think indeed that generative AI is going to be focused really on knowledge workers. And as such, I think it's just going to have like us move to a higher order of functions. And I think that's an agreement with the whole automation game we're saying. So I'm hopeful on that front. That said, again, software development apparently, again, Eric, you're the source of my information, so I don't know, but might actually change significantly as you like, maybe we're going to have a much smaller percent or number of software developers, it sounds. And then you're going to have some additional functions that you will start seeing, right? You will need your AI ethicist, your AI strategy, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to the very front office positions, to make it like specific to finance, I still think, listen, I come from a fundamental shop. So the human brain is the beginning and the end. So I don't see significant change. It's going to be auxiliary. It's going to be about efficiency, maybe idea generation, but the final say is going to be still at the end. Hope that helps. It's many different pieces, but
I would agree with that. I think they're all very good points. What I would add to it is if we look at the sort of history, if we go, let's pull back and look what software development was like in its beginning, how it transformed and where it's going. In the beginning, I remember you would have a problem. When I was working at Morgan Stanley in equity derivatives in the 90s. And someone would come in and say, we want a model to do this, or do an average rate option or something, and add a few more features. And when we wrote this, we literally started in an editor, typed main, parenthesis, and started just coding. Like, we didn't use anything. The only library we used was like the floating point library, right? and it was called math.h, I think, if I remember correctly. And it would stand by itself, and it would be then put into another system. It would be called, and it would work. Today, you've got I don't know what the latest development environment is, but a lot of people are doing web apps and are using whatever the latest generation of that code is. It's one area which I never learned to code, but they're doing it, and they have lots of very complex things, and they keep changing and they keep going. I think the latest one is called Type something, but I think that's going to go away. because I think that generative AI will be very good at producing web interfaces. I always wondered why it hadn't been automated a long time ago. I hope I'm not offending anyone. But you shouldn't have 20 people working on one user interface for a program. I just don't, doesn't make sense to me. I think that the same thing is true with the way large, systems are put together, where you have a team of people worrying about authentication, a team of people worrying about, we're going through this massive move into AWS from on-prem, and I don't want to tell you how many people involved. And if anything could make it go faster, we would buy it. So I wish generative AI could do that. And it would free people up. No one's having fun doing this. I mean, it's very difficult, it's very painstaking. And, we need help. But when I think it comes back to what software people sort of originally did, was solve problems. Someone would come in and say, we need something that's going to do this. So you're going to have a person there. And whatever power tools you can give them so they can go from that expression of an idea to a solution, they will welcome AI assistance. And I don't think we're going to be eliminating the total number of people working in the field, because we're going more and more into digital transformation, into everything, and it will keep demanding more things, whether you're talking about medicine. I mean, I was just asked to speak to a group of data scientists working at Memorial Sloan Kettering, trying to figure out why these immunotherapies only work on 60% of the patients, and the other 60 just stops. And they're generating terabytes of data. They've got these machines which can analyze DNA sequences. They call them multiplex sequencers. It's just throwing all this data out. They don't begin to know what to do, to process it all. And they were very happy to learn about machine learning and AI, because most of them are still using classical techniques to deal with this. So there will be an endless supply of problems to solve, and the more efficient people get at solving them, the better off we'll all be.
Like for us, it's a lot of the same themes, right? So we can have things like the back office function that tends to do kind of research and tries to figure out what sector a company belongs to, what they actually do, summarize it so we push it on the platform. That's typically a human actually will be doing that. But what we've been doing is we will use basically these type of models to augment the human. So the human becomes more of a reviewer than a generator of content, right? So we have a big content team, and we retrain the folks to actually use those tools. And so it's more of an efficiency than a replacement, if you want to think of it.
And there's a numbers argument, right? Like, what's the minimum wage? I don't know, $15, $20, whatever, right? It takes $20 a month to have a subscription at ChatGPT Plus, which means that if you have 1 hour worth of savings, right, in your work, like instead of 7 hours, you do 6, you already paid for the subscription just to work out the numbers. So that's one way that I like to think. And the other way that I like to think also is that it's not about the $20 you save, let's say, because you continue using it, but the extra that the human can do is probably in 1 hour more higher value. And especially in finance. Clearly, we're not talking about minimum wage. You have people that are really very well paid, right? And every single hour that you can save more than pays multiple times the cost, and on top of that, enables them to think more, right? So I don't think it's the savings, it's the actual thing. That's why I agree. It's not about having fewer people.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about needing less time so that the remainder of the time goes to higher value functions and operations.
No, that's exactly it. On that note, we're over time. Sorry, but thank you very much for coming and a really good, amazing discussion.